Hello! For those who have not seen me before, my name's Derek Bailey. I've been a wood turner now for over 40 years and taught for the last 8 of them. For those who aren't familiar with me, I've been running, I've started running beginners lessons. I've done 2 previous lessons, spindle turning, and one was a test piece which I like to call a bumpy shiny stick, and the other was the actual working to dimensions. So now we're going to take it a stage further. What we're going to do now is to make 2 items, and we're going to introduce some early bowl turning techniques in producing the base of a candlestick. Right, they're separate. You can make candlesticks all in one if you've got a piece of timber wide enough at the bottom, but I don't want to do that. I want to introduce 2 parts, the stem and the base. The base is we'll be using some bowl turning techniques, and the spindle turning, which is more precise than the one I did in lesson 2. A bit more involved, a bit more intricacy, but hopefully will be a pleasurable experience in trying to produce it. The timber we'll be turning from blank. I won't even chop the corners off. Some people tend to chop the corners off, which is great, but I want to show you that it is possible to turn without chopping the corners off, or turning it, or bandsawing it circular to begin with, because if you buy timber pre-cut to a circle, it's slightly more expensive than if you can cut your own off with a saw or something like that, and not everybody has bandsaws to take the corners off. So we'll be doing that. Anyway, enough waffling, let's get on. For those who have watched my previous videos, I'm about to put 2 crosses on the end of the stem blank and centre punch the centre of the crosses so that I can locate it between centres in the lathe. Here I'm using a mallet to drive the drive centre teeth into one end of the stem blank. Sometimes, depending on how big the lathe is, I can usually do this between centres and screw the quill with the revolving centre to force the stem against the drive centre teeth. But it's not advisable because it doesn't do the bearings of the lathe any good, no matter how big the lathe is. Because the handle on the tailstock is very small, I can hardly get any real purchase and force against the stem blank, which is why it's essential to hammer the drive centre into one end of the stem to avoid this. As I've mentioned in all my previous videos in this tuition series, it is essential that you pivot on your back foot and front foot, keeping your arms against your body and using your body to move the tool across the tool rest and resulting in an even cut along the length of the timber. If you notice, I'm not grabbing hold of the tool and gripping very tightly. It's just a reasonably firm grip which allows you to be sensitive to the friction of the cut and thus gaining feedback, which then again helps to train your muscle memory. Don't forget to project the tool rest beyond the end of the timber. Then just get into the habit of putting the tool on the tool rest first before you approach the timber. Once you touch the timber with the heel of the bevel, raise the handle until you see a cut coming from the cutting edge and then move the tool with your body. To avoid keep stopping the lathe, I'm just checking to see if the cylinder is perfectly round by using the back of the gouge. To create a better finish on the timber, I rotate the tool approximately 40 degrees so that the straight edge of the tool comes into play. That creates a wider cut, slightly wider cut, which generates a better finish. Notice I'm putting my index finger against the tool rest as I move the tool. This helps to generate a straight cutting action with less undulations on the surface. I noticed greater friction on the movement of the tool along the tool rest. This is down to normal wear, so I put a bit of candle wax on the top, which makes it much better. As the drawing is to scale, I can use the actual drawing as a template to produce the candlestick stem. Using the drawing folded on the centre line, I'm using the edges of the profile to mark the timber. And each mark indicates an element, a shape element on the drawing, and those marks are used to guide my parting tool towards the correct depth or diameters of the different elements. As the base of the candlestick is separate to the stem, I'm marking the position of the tenon on the stem, which will then be glued to the base at a later date. The small marks are obviously not visible when the wood is rotating, so I'm rotating the wood by hand to establish the marks along the full circumference of the stem. Just to make sure, I switch the lathe on and emphasise the lines so that I can see them better. It's always best to place the drawing where you can see it whilst you're turning, as a constant reminder to how to approach the different shapes and elements. Using the outside calipers, I measure from the drawing the element which has the smallest diameter. Because the smallest diameter on the stem is not too small as to cause vibration whilst I'm turning, then I use this as my first depth with the parting tool. Now it's a case of using the parting tool and plunging to the different depths of the elements and then blending the whole lot together by using a spindle gouge or roughing out gouge, which you can be seen later in the video. To prevent the wood from splintering at the edge as I plunge the parting tool in, I scour each line that I've made with the bottom corner of the parting tool so as to sever the fibres before I plunge in to the depths required. Because the drawing is to scale, or I drew it, I could have used it as a source of the dimensions for my calipers, but old habits die hard and I've reverted back to my ruler. Here I'm just setting the calipers to the largest element on the stem. Now the depths of the more important elements have been set with the parting tool, I will now use the spindle roughing out gouge to do the majority of wood removal. Notice how I'm removing wood either side of the gap created with the porting tool, taking care to work from the highest diameter down to the lowest. If I start cutting uphill, then the finish on the wood will be far worse. While the wood is nowhere near the finished shape, this is an opportunity to gain experience of using this tool and gradually remove wood very slowly so as to gain the correct skills required. I often use a larger diameter needed in order to get my body and muscle memory ready for the final cuts as I near the finished shape. Notice how I'm turning the spindle roughing gouge as I approach the shoulder so that the edge of the roughing gouge is matching the shoulder. This is the beauty of this tool. You can keep rotating it you can cover quite a large area of the tool itself to do the work. There are no sweet spots on this tool, by the way. It's easy to get too carried away with the process of removing wood, so from time to time I keep bringing up the drawing just to remind me exactly what I'm doing. Here I'm deciding which parting tool to use for the narrow gaps that I need to produce the elements required. I've gone for the slightly wider parting tool, which came with a set of micro turning tools you can get. As you can see, again, I'm using the bottom corner of the parting tool on its side just to scour the edges and sever the fibres to stop the fraying of the edges. Here's a problem I hadn't anticipated, in that I made a gap with the parting tool that wasn't wide enough for the outside calipers to go into. What I should have done, without just guessing, I should have measured the distance from the inner diameter and the outside diameter to see what it was, until it was equal to half the dimension between the inner diameter taken away from the outer diameter that was shown on the drawing. Now I've done the basic shape with the spindle roughing gouge, it's time to introduce the spindle gouge to do the more finer details that are required. Now I've removed the bulk of the wood and sort of given a rough shape to the candlestick stem, it's time to introduce the 3/8 spindle gouge to do more refined detail. For such a long cove, it might have been more prudent to use a 1/2 inch spindle gouge, but the 3/8 spindle gouge, although a little bit more difficult to use, especially on long curves, is good practice, and seeing as I've a fair bit of wood to remove yet to the final detail, I might as well practice before I get down to the finished size. As I indicated on my very first beginner's tutorial video, I'm illustrating the sweet spot that's on the 3/8 gouge. There are two sweet spots, one to the left and one to the right of the centre of the flute, and it's with that sweet spot that stays in contact with the wood at all times, and that removes the wood in a more consistent and pleasurable way. During this period, I noticed that the spindle gouge wasn't cutting very well. If you have a look at the dust, the chips coming off, there were no ribbons really. It was very small particles and dust, and I thought it was the grinding of the chisel. But I later discovered there was some vibration on the. I don't think it was down to the small diameter. I was just getting some vibration as I was turning. There is a way out of that, but we'll come to that at a later tuition video. However, for the process of this video, I tolerated the slight aggravation of not being able to cut beautifully and continued and persevered later with a bit of abrasives. Good old abrasives can get you out of tricky situations, although it's not particularly tricky, it's just vibration marks that have been left on the turned piece, which the abrasives will remove. Here I'm rolling the bead using the left and the right sweet spots of the spindle gouge. For beginners, or for anyone else for that matter, I always like to leave things a little bit larger than the finished size. I can practice rolling the bead while I've plenty of wood to take off, and then hopefully I perfected the movement by the time I get down to the correct size. I hope you can just see in the top right hand corner. Now it's time to start turning the half cove, which is near the top of the candlestick. If you noticed, I used the bottom corner of the parting tool to make a slight incision where I want to start the spindle gouge. This prevents the wood from splaying out, especially when you're starting from the top of the cylinder and there's no room for further wood removal. I've reverted back to the spindle gouge now to refine the finished shape of the centre of the stem. If you notice, when I get to the bottom of the curve, I slightly twist the spindle gouge flute towards the shoulder and then draw back away from the bottom of the curve, just skimming off the surface of the shoulder with the bottom edge of the spindle gouge. I'm just using the parting tool now to set the final bead, which is near the base of the candlestick, ready for the spindle gouge to do its work. Here I'm using the parting tool to just make the tenon a bit bigger than the finished size, but just enough to remind me that the tenon is there. If you don't start putting elements there, you can forget. And the worst thing you can do is turn off the tenon thinking that you've forgotten all about it. Then you can't fix it to the base. So it's best to just keep reminding yourself of what elements and what designs need to be done, even though you're not taking them down to the actual size. I prefer to use the sprung outside calipers for dimensioning while the wood is rotating. Although it can be a bit cumbersome to measure it against a ruler compared to the vernier or digital calipers, which give an immediate reading, I prefer the sprung outside calipers when I'm actually sizing the work, rotating work. If I use the digital calipers, although some people do, I get a little bit nervous because I don't fancy a catch with the digital calipers while the wood is rotating. They're made of metal and they're quite sharp and can do you some damage if they get caught. As you can see, I'm using the parting tool and waggle it from side to side, just taking small cuts. It's more convenient to do that than getting the spindle gouge. It gets right up into the corners and makes nice square edges ready for it to be glued to the base. I'm just finishing the top of the candlestick now, and any other work ready for using the abrasives. Now I've sized the tenon, I'm just removing the rest of the material to get it down to a very small pip. When you're turning between centres, don't go right through the wood. It can jam and fling out and destroy all the lovely work you've done. Just leave a little pip that you can take off with a junior hacksaw. As you can see, the vibration of the wood is getting on my nerves a little bit here, and I'm trying to find the source of it, which I didn't really succeed in doing it. Now, whether it was the wood, which I can't imagine it was, it must be either the lathe, which isn't secured properly, or the tailstock, which isn't quite bedded down when I use the locking lever. But I still haven't really got to the bottom of why there was such vibration. I thought the cause of the problem may be the small revolving centre, so I changed over to the more robust conical revolving centre, but no, it didn't seem to solve the problem. You may be able to see the vibration marks left by the spindle gouge to the right of the palm of my hand. The only thing I can think it is the mahogany itself is quite light, very dry, and probably quite weak, especially when I've turned the tenon on the end, as you can see, and that's the only thing I can think it is, that it's the wood itself is quite weak and can't cope with small diameters. I've turned the sound on here to give you an idea what vibration sounds like. It must be because I'm taking the tenon down to a very small diameter, but that vibration was happening when I was doing the rest of the turning before I started turning the tenon. So all I can think of is it is the timber. Anyway, it's the abrasives at a later stage will take those slight vibration marks out of the surface of the wood. So things should be okay.
the top sport of the stimmy. All the games, all the goals, all the time on Talksport.
To do the base, I'm going to introduce the wood screw chuck I made on lesson 3A. First of all, it's a simple matter of drilling a hole in the middle of the base. Some of you may have noticed that the block I'm using is split. It's okay, I glued it together overnight with some PVA glue. I'm just measuring the root diameter of the screw in the screw chuck and selecting a drill to suit. A 4mm drill is required. I could have drilled the hole straight through the blank, but there's no point really. I'm only holding it on for temporary to just clean up the base, ready to reverse on the screw chuck at a later stage. I'm happy with the screw chuck, it does its job well, and the blank feels nice and secure when fully tightened. It's always reassuring to know that you've drilled a hole on centre, even at my time of life. It's a little disconcerting if you've got it off centre and the lathe starts vibrating. I'm going to use a 1/2-inch bowl gouge for this job. I'm turning approximately a 6-inch square blank. Some people may argue why not use a spindle gouge. Well, a spindle gouge has a more open flute to it and it is more subject to catching. A bowl gouge has a deep flute and has less chance of catching. And you feel more secure with it because of its larger section. It doesn't matter how small your lathe is, a bowl gouge is still suitable, even though it looks a little big and unwieldy. Here I'm just using the bottom curve of the flute. I'm not twisting the bowl gouge, that can come later when I've got the square wood nearer to round. To begin with, it's safer just to use the bottom part of the curve of the flute where there's less wood removal and it's easier to control the cut. It's always good to keep an eye on the gap between the tool rest and the revolving timber. As you turn the timber, you reduce the diameter quite quickly, and it's easy to get caught up in the moment, and the gap increases quite large between the tool rest and the timber, and makes it harder to control the cut. Notice I'm moving the tool very slowly, horizontally. Because of intermittent cutting, if you do it too quickly, you can end up taking big cuts which can stop the rotation of the timber, especially on a small lathe like this. So it's better just to be prudent with the amount of timber you're reducing in one go. Just take it nice and easily along the tool rest until you've got to a reasonable diameter. Once you've removed the corners of the timber so that the wood is rotating reasonably well without any undue vibrations, you can afford to speed the rotation of the lathe up. This makes cutting easier and you can traverse the tool along the tool rest more quickly. Now I'm approaching a complete circle without any flat spots. Notice that I rotate the tool clockwise when I'm pulling the tool towards me, and anti-clockwise when I'm pushing the tool away. I work from edges into the middle rather than the middle to the edges, because if you do work from the middle to the edges of the wood will spray out or feather, which can lead to complications later on if you depending on what the design of the base is. So it's better to work from the edges into the middle. To improve the finish of the cut, notice how I've changed the orientation of the tool so that I'm cutting on the bottom cutting edge and pulling towards me. I'm actually creating a shearing action, or shear scraping as some people like to call it. It produces a better finish, takes less wood off, but leaves a smoother and less torn grain. It's quite amazing how often this happens when you turn the timber down. You get rid of all the square and you come into a cylinder and you just notice some cracks. Don't worry about it, we'll just make the cracks sound. It's part of the wood, so you can't change it. There's no point in getting another blank and starting afresh. Just make the cracks sound so it doesn't spread, and that's part of the fascination of wood turning. Sometimes wood imperfections can be quite attractive. Here I'm using a glue, cyanoacrylate, which is called CA for short. It's very, very useful in wood turning, dries extremely quickly, and it has an activator that makes it dry within seconds.
Our position is that the price we are paying for a small increase in accuracy is at odds with the spirit of our game, and as a result we should remove it from the 2024-2025 season onwards. Bear in mind, before VAR came in, 82% of the decisions were right. Now that it's in, 96% of the decisions are
After I've skimmed the surface with the bowl gouge, I'm just checking to see if the CA glue has penetrated the crack, which it has, so I'm happy with that.
crying about before, about how refereeing decisions. The big question is are the referees operating at a high enough standard?
To clean up the face, I use the bottom cutting edge of the bowl gouge and use the top cutting edge as a guide, keeping a gap between the wood and the edge. If you tilt it in the wrong way, either twisting or you push the handle away from you, you will get a more severe cut. We're only cleaning up the surface, so the best guide is to use the top edge gap of about 0.5 millimeter as a guide, and it has to be parallel to the direction of cut. Do not twist or move the handle away from you, or else you'll get a dig in. Notice how I'm gripping the tool with my fingers and moving the palm of my hand along the tool rest, keeping that gap of 0.5 millimeter for the non-cutting edge at the top. Go in a nice steady movement using your body to lean back and forwards as you cut. I'm now testing with the flat edge of the ruler to see how square or flat I've managed to turn the wood. Now I've got it nice and flat or slightly concave. It should sit properly on the bench without wobbling, so I'm now going to use abrasives starting at 100 grit down to 320 grit. I nearly forgot, before I finish the sanding, I forgot to drill a hole, so I'm going to drill the 4 millimeter hole now, which unfortunately will be permanent. We won't be using a 4-jaw chuck at this juncture, just a screw chuck, so unfortunately a hole has to remain. If we used a 4-jaw chuck, we'd be able to make a recess in the bottom and make it an attractive feature, but that can come at a later stage. I must be careful not to get too carried away with this drilling, or else I'll hit the screw in the screw chuck if I'm not careful. So as soon as it goes through, I can feel the difference as I've gone through and mated up with the hole at the other end. Now I can get back to the abrasives and go down to 320 grit. Once I've got to 180 grit, I've decided to use an abrasive paste. It originated under the name of Yorkshire Grit, but now there are some competitors now. It's the same sort of stuff. It's a bit like T-cut you get for cars. And the advantage of it, it produces a nice finish, but also you don't get the dust. Apply the paste on the stationary item, and then once you've covered the item in it, it doesn't have to be a lot. You're not buttering toast here, depending on how fastidious you are with the butter, of course. And switch the lathe on and keep going. And I usually test a kitchen roll, white kitchen roll, and if it's still staining the kitchen roll, that means there's still a bit of residue left. But you can't get rid of it totally, and the sanding sealer and melamine will take care of that later on. I'm now using a finer grade of Yorkshire Grit paste. I don't exactly know what the grit equivalent is. I think it's something like 400 or 500 equivalent to an abrasive sheet. Now I've finished with the Yorkshire Grit, I can apply 1 coat of sanding sealer, then burnish with sawdust, then 1 coat of melamine, burnish with sawdust, and then a final coat of melamine. Cellulose sanding sealer and cellulose melamine take very little time to dry. In fact, it's drying about 20 seconds, even faster in this warm weather. I use sawdust in between applying the sanding sealer and the melamine. After completing the finishing on the underside of the base blank, I can now reverse chuck it onto the screw chuck. I've chosen a drill about 1mm less diameter than the tenon on the stem. This is so that I can adjust the fitting by using a tool to bore out the hole that I drill. I've measured the length of the tenon on the stem, and I'll just produce a hole slightly longer to fit the tenon. I'm just adjusting the quill lock on top of the tailstock just to eliminate some slight vibration. It's not an exact fit of the quill inside the tailstock, so I'm just reducing the vibration a little bit. I'm just truing up and squaring off the base, ready for fitting the stem. It's essential that I don't leave a raised portion around the hole where the tenon's going. Normally it should be perfectly flat or slightly concave, so that when I mate up the stem with the base there won't be a gap showing of the mating parts. In order to size the hole for the tenon, most tools are a little bit big for this, only a small hole, so I've converted an old woodworking chisel made of mild steel and just ground an edge on it, on the front and the side. Old wood turning chisels are great for little things like that. You're not removing a lot of wood, but it takes away a tricky situation. For goodness sake, don't use engineering files and convert them. They're too brittle and can snap. I'm just turning the first 2 or 3 millimeters of the hole to test the tenon first. Once I've established the fit, I can finish off the hole so that it can completely mate together. Now I fit it, it's running slightly out of true, but once I bring up the tailstock, that'll eliminate any of the eccentricity. I'm just using standard PVA glue for this, and use it once I put the item together. It's a nice firm push fit. The tailstock is used as a clamp, and I can continue turning, and the glue will dry overnight, so it doesn't really interfere with the turning process. Back to using the drawing again as a template for marking off the shapes needed for the base. I'm using the bowl gouge again for this. It's a sweeping convex, half convex curve. So you've got to be careful that you don't choose a bowl gouge with a very long bevel, because the shortness of the bevel determines how tight a curve you can make. The same principle applies to the bowl gouge as it does to the spindle gouge. There's a sweet spot, and again it's roughly in the same place on the bowl gouge as it was, or as they were on the spindle gouge. Like spindle turning, bowl turning, you can actually go uphill as opposed to just concentrating on downhill. Here I'm just using downhill, but the funny thing is about bowl turning, I'm actually going against the grain. And you will notice at a later stage that the wood is beginning to split. If you go downwards like this, there's a tendency for the wood to flake away. But it's okay because mahogany is quite an even grain figuring, if any figuring at all. But if you have large figuring like pine or walnut or anything where the grain is a feature, it's better to come uphill, starting at the base of where the stem is and working your way up. But you can also do it this way as long as it's split, so you don't tear the grain too much, because you'll be cleaning up anyway at a later stage. But you'll notice later on that I'll be shear scraping the curve. As you can see, I'm using the bottom cutting edge of the gouge to act as a scraper, slightly with the handle slightly angled down of the gouge to create a shearing action, and I'm just rounding off the top edge of the base. Here I altered my decision on the actual diameter of the base. It looked more aesthetically pleasing on a slightly bigger diameter than was indicated on the drawing. I wish I had a £1 coin for every time I found a crack that was hidden deep within the timber. I'd be a rich man by now. Anyway, it's back to the CA glue and a bit more turning and finishing.
But you've got Sanchez, not a fan of either, really.
Here I'm using the bottom cutting edge of the gouge, incorporating a shear scraping action, pulling the tool towards me, but if you notice the tool rest is parallel to the bed of the lathe, so I have to draw back slowly, following the curve that I'd made previously. Also, the shear scraping action smooths off any tool marks I'd left and takes away the torn grain at the base of the curve.
I never had a lot of injuries. Okay, a couple of quick questions for you, because I really want to take calls now. Reece James.
Here I'm obviously measuring the diameter of the candle, which will go in the top of the stem. And I'll use a Forstner bit in a Jacob's chuck and replace the revolving centre and use the Forstner bit to support the stem in the lathe.
You should do it, but I get it. When you've been up for that long and someone blatantly fouls you like that.
I'm running at about 500 RPM here. There's no digital readout on the lathe, so I'm having to approximate it. We don't want to overheat the Forstner bit. And gently rotate the tailstock handle for about a quarter turn, and then just relieving it for half a second, then another quarter turn, until I eventually get to the depth required, which is about 15 millimeters. I'm just checking the top here to see if the finish is okay. I can just get away with the normal abrasives. Now it's just a case of putting the revolving centre back in and using abrasives to get down to the final finish. Of course, with sawdust in between sanding sealer and melamine. I mustn't forget my mask. Back to the Yorkshire grit, standard and fine, and then the normal finishing, which is sanding sealer and 2 coats of melamine. Due to the fact there's more detail and slight gaps, which I find it hard to get sanding sealer or melamine into the crevices, I've used spray sanding sealer and spray melamine. I'm using the back of my hand to test for dryness. Better than using fingers, because you end up, if it is slightly wet or damp, it'll leave finger marks. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Oh yes, and by the way, the drawing for this candlestick will have a link in the description to this video. All the best. See you later.